And welcome back, everybody. Dave Dyke's our guest. We're talking about Dave's 40-year history at the Observer-Dispatch and 7 years before that at the Rome Sentinel. Dave, we mentioned Walter D. Edmonds. Another one that I was very interested in that you did an interview with because of your background as a trumpeter was Doc Severinsen. When Doc Severinsen was in the area, you interviewed him. How'd that go?
That was probably one of my more memorable ones. Being a trumpet player, I wanted to talk to him. And the main question I wanted to ask him is whether his mother made him practice when he was little or not. And so I kind of hung around.
What was the answer to that?
Well, I kind of hung around, and because I never liked to ask my questions, as you know, in front of other media, because then they had the TV.
Yeah.
The TV had all the answers to my questions before I get a chance to write it. So I hung around and waited, and the media interview ended, and I watched Doc. He went down, and he went down into the dressing room at the Stanley, and I followed him down there, and I started talking to him down there, and yes, his mother did make a practice.
Mm-hmm. Did yours?
Yeah, she did, but I asked him how he got his name Doc, and everybody think it was because his father was a dentist, and they called him Little Doc. They called his father Doc, and they called him Little Doc, and that's how he got the nickname. But we were talking, and we were having a great conversation. He's just a regular down-to-earth guy, and we're talking, and they were getting ready. They were waiting for him upstairs, and they wanted to send him out. They wanted to take him out to dinner before the show that night. And they sent a rather charming lady down, violinist, down into the dressing room, and she came down, and we're in the middle of a conversation, and she said to Doc, she says, "They sent me down here for you," and Doc looked at me and he says, "I'll see you, Dave," and that was the end of the conversation. But he was a great guy. Great guy. Talking
about great guys, you had the good fortune to work for two great guys, two great bosses, Frank Tomeno, city editor for many years at the OD, and Tony Vella, managing editor at the OD. When I mention Frank's name, what comes to mind, Dave?
Probably someone who has more ability to retain knowledge than anybody I've ever seen in my life. He'll tell you who the Secretary of State was under John Tyler. Mm-hmm. He remembers everything. When it comes to history, Frank he's better than the library, because in the library you have to look things up, and even on the internet, Frank's like a walking Google. When it comes to especially local history, I mean, he knows American history as well, but local history, he's just just a quality class guy. He's a very high caliber person.
He was a good guy to work for too, wasn't he, Dave?
Wonderful guy to work for.
Yeah. And Tony Vella was one of the people responsible for the Observer-Dispatch winning a Pulitzer Prize. What comes to mind when you think of Tony?
Well, you know, when I got hired by Gil Smith way back when, Tony was sitting in the office, and you know how Tony was. He had that deadpan look on his face all the time.
He probably had a Pall Mall cigarette in his mouth too.
Yeah, he did enjoy his smoking. Yeah. And back in the days when you didn't even need to bring cigarettes into the newsroom, because you could just inhale and you'd be all set. But I was scared to death of Tony, because here's a guy who had helped win a Pulitzer Prize. Which is, you know, what do you do after that? And he knew more about city government. City government was Tony's thing, and he was just so, and he snarled, and he was just always very, but very low key. Never got excited, but Tony, I came to think of Tony like a father afterwards, after I got to know him, because we shared a lot of things in common. I never won the Pulitzer Prize, but beyond that, we both had two daughters, and he'd give me a lot of advice on what to do. He told me to buy Gannett stock, and and I did, and I'm glad I did. And he told me, you know, not to take things too seriously when I would get a little upset about something. And he had one, and I'm sure you know this, Joe. He had one when I was the news editor. I was in charge of the front page and of course Tony was my boss. And he'd go home, and he had one order that he would give us, and it would be, "Don't surprise me."
Yeah.
And so.
And don't surprise him meant that he didn't want to wake up in the morning and read something in the paper and not be prepared for it, right?
Exactly.
Yeah.
Exactly.
Yeah. Dave, it's a pleasure having you in, but I've got a lot more questions. Maybe you'll come back for a part 2.
Yeah, we can do that.
Yeah.
We can do that. This went a lot faster than I thought it would.
It always does. Dave DeDyke, thank you much. We'll have you back for part 2 next week. Take care of yourself, and don't forget CNYhomepage.com. There's lots of good stuff there. Until next time, take care.